Again, younger voters, they're the biggest demographic group to swing toward Kamala Harris since Joe Biden stepped off the ticket. Now, I don't think that's all about the embrace of memes. I don't think that's all about the use of things like TikTok. It certainly has something to do with changing out a candidate who is more than 80 years old to somebody who is younger. But I think it's important to point out that in politics, just like in almost every other industry, trying to understand young consumers is key to building your future, to building what your industry will look like for the long term, and to find ways to have that appeal. What we're finding in politics is that when young people are consuming political content on social media, they're often doing it in ways that don't look anything like what you or I might be looking at. For instance, it's not so much that they're looking at the New York Times or CNN just on TikTok. It's that the influencers they're following also have political messages. The walls have come down between the content they're getting about their consumer lives and the content they're getting about their political lives. When we ask people where they get their news, if you're over the age of 26, it's probably local TV, network news. You might use something like Facebook or YouTube. But for Gen Z, it is a bunch of sources that are just very, very, very different than where older generations are getting their information. And the way that this winds up being successfully deployed, and where I think the lessons are for industries who really want to understand Gen Z the best, is take something like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, clearly a rising star in the Democratic Party. She did an excellent job wowing the crowd on the first night of the Democratic Convention. She is one of the smartest political communicators out there today. I think Republicans underestimate her at their own peril because she does things like shows up on skincare Instagram Reels and TikToks. Now, why would a member of Congress show up on skincare influencer pages? She did this because she was talking about regulations around skincare. If you've ever traveled to Europe or Asia, you may know that you can buy certain types of skincare overseas, especially sunscreen, that you can't buy here in the US because of the way it's regulated. And so she was smart. Instead of writing something for a political audience, she went to people who might have no interest in political news whatsoever and spoke to them with a message about something specific that they care about, policy around skincare regulation, and wound up using that as a way to introduce herself, to become more personable, to get herself on the radar of unlikely voters. I think this kind of communication, where the wall between political and non-political information and influence is getting more blurred, is the future. Gen Z is there, but it is coming for everyone very quickly. The idea that your politics and all of the rest of your brain and all of the rest of your information are going to be separate, those walls are coming down, and they are coming down fast. And in this election, we are seeing it with Gen Z political attitudes and their swing toward Kamala Harris, but this is not something that's just going to be confined to politics, as brands and industries have to grapple with, what do I do when my audience, especially my Gen Z customer base or employee base, becomes more political? So the New York Times, back when millennials were young, wrote a piece about what happens when millennials run the workplace. And it was a very scary article about millennials being these like weird young people who just wanted to ride around the office on scooters and have free snacks, and that's all they really wanted from employers. And that has now given way to the 37-year-olds, who are now millennials, of course, are afraid of the 23-year-olds who work for them. The 20-somethings are rolling their eyes at the habits of their elders, in a long-standing trend, but many employers say there's a new boldness in the way Gen Z dictates taste. Gen Z is not waiting for anyone to approve of what they think or what they have to say. They are here to drive things. And so you all may be encountering that as well in your industry, in your associations, with younger employees who you're working with, that they just have a different way of getting information and a different way of viewing the world. Now, I will say, I want to give Gen Z a little bit of defense. Their best view is that pop culture was the very best in the 1990s. We asked a variety of questions about culture, music, fashion. What do you think was the best decade? And the one thing that millennials and Gen Zers agree on was that the 90s were absolutely the best. But beyond that, I know sometimes Gen Zers, their approach to the world can seem a little bit out there for people of other generations. What I want you to know is that for Gen Z, what they buy, where they work, how they vote, these things are all tied up in one another. And that's why what I'm talking to you about today with regards to this election, even if you all aren't involved in politics one way or the other, surely you have members who have political interests. Surely sometimes you're going to get questions about things that are adjacent to politics, and how you navigate them will be really key to the success of your club, your industry moving forward. Because key number 9 is the number of Americans who say CEOs should unequivocally speak out on social causes. What we found over the last couple of years was that there was originally a movement toward more and more business leaders saying they wanted to speak out on political issues. That they felt like, given our turbulent politics, given the fact that it seemed like so many people had given up on politics and government as a way to solve problems, that CEOs in business should be stepping up to be at the forefront of pushing for social change and driving the conversation on important issues. And so a consultancy that I've worked with called the Brunswick Group, they did a really interesting study. They did a survey where they asked people and they asked just CEOs a bunch of different questions about messaging and political engagement. They asked, do you believe that CEOs should be speaking out on these causes? And 65% of CEOs said, yes, we're great at it. We do a wonderful job. We absolutely should. And only about a third of people said the same. There's a real beginning to be a bit of an exhaustion and a backlash to political division that seems like it is touching everything these days. That nowadays there are brands of all kinds who are worried about potentially getting name-checked in a presidential debate, or somehow getting under the eyes of regulators, or having a member of Congress decide that they're going to pick a fight. Here in Florida, you saw it play out with Disney versus Ron DeSantis in very, very big and explosive fashion. And people don't like that we are so divided. So this is from the Pew Research Center. They did a study last fall where they asked people, can you describe in one word how you feel about our politics? You may notice on this chart that there are a couple of circles. It's probably in too small a print for you to see. They've had to redact the word because it's not family friendly. That's how people are feeling about things in this country today. They are frustrated, they are mad, they are fed up, and they don't like how divided we are. And they especially don't like it when they think that their politics are winding up driving decisions that are of the leaders in other parts of their lives. And so we're seeing an America that's really looking for a turning down of the temperature. We're seeing an America that really wants to make sure that their political leaders are governing well, but they want to be able to shop, do business, et cetera, without feeling like it always has to be making a political statement these days. I want to wrap up as a pollster by leaving you with number 10, which is the average error in swing state public polling in polls conducted 2 weeks before the 2020 election. So let me stop and explain what that means. So as a pollster, back when I started in this industry 20 years ago, when I would tell people that I had just gotten a job working as a pollster, the questions that I would often get were, does this mean that you're going to be calling people up on the phone, asking them questions? I'd have to explain that no, there's a call center that does that. I'm just the person who's writing the questions and interpreting the results. But nowadays, when I do business travel and I get into an Uber at an airport and the driver wants to be chatty and ask me questions and be friendly and says, where are you coming from? And tell me a little bit about what you do. I used to say, well, I'm coming from Washington, D.C. and I work as a pollster. Now I don't say either of those things. I say I'm a researcher, which is accurate but vague, and I say I'm coming in from Virginia, which is also accurate and is where the airport is. And it winds up getting me out of a lot of uncomfortable conversations about people saying, hey, I never get polled. How can these polls be accurate? No one's ever called me. Weren't they off? Don't they miss all the time? I don't understand why we do them. Isn't the media just using them to try to persuade people and manipulate the election? I get it. I am a pollster. I get all the things that can go wrong in a survey. I remember the sinking feeling of sitting on TV on air at about 2 o'clock in the morning on election night of 2016, knowing that I had felt pretty confident I knew how that night was going to go, and it going very differently. My anxiety having less to do with caring if it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump who won, and more just grave concern about the future of my industry. What was going to happen to pollsters after we just got it so horribly wrong? Well, without boring you too much, in the last couple of elections, the pollsters have gotten it pretty wrong. In 2012, we got it wrong because we frankly, as an industry, weren't calling people up on their cell phones enough. How many of you, when you get a call on your cell phone from a number you don't know, pick it up? Yeah, see, that's a big problem for my industry because that's one of the key ways that we do research to try to contact you. We like to call people now on their cell phones. Back in 2012 was the beginning of that becoming a really big problem for pollsters. And that meant that we had too few people who are what we might call an unlikely voter. Someone who doesn't really care that much about politics. Maybe they don't have a big voting history, but at the last minute they decided to show up. Those were the voters who threw off all the polling in 2012 and made voters and people who consume news think the election was going to be closer than it was. Then in 2016, the polls swung the opposite way. Instead of overestimating the Republicans, they overestimated the Democrats. And why did they do that? They did that because people changed their minds at the last minute in a way that polls weren't capturing. Most people like me, we go into the field, we're asking people their opinions, but it then takes a day or two to process that information. And so if you have a bunch of voters who all in, say, the last week of an election change their mind, I don't know, the FBI director decides he's going to do an additional level of investigation into one of the candidates, who can really say? But all of a sudden, a couple people changed their minds, and that was part of what threw the polling off. But it was also the fact that polls had way too many voters that had college degrees. There are a lot of types of voters in this country where if you have the right balance in your survey or not doesn't really matter. If I do a poll and I'm asking people, who are you voting for president? And then I ask, what's your favorite type of ice cream? It doesn't matter if my survey sample has too many people in it who really like chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla or strawberry or Rocky Road or what have you. It doesn't really matter. But if I have too many men or too many old respondents, too many women, if I have too many respondents who have a college degree, those are all the sorts of things that can make my sample really messed up and make my survey not totally unrepresentative of what happens in an election. And in 2016, that's just what happened. Pollsters weren't keeping track of how much education do all of my respondents have. They were viewing it more akin to, do I have enough strawberry ice cream fans in my survey? Didn't really matter, wasn't being checked on. But after 2016 and after the polling debacle that year, now it's being checked on. In 2020, the polls missed again, and pollsters said, well, we think it was COVID-19. We think that it was really high turnout, again, missing some of those unlikely voters. But honestly, we're not really that sure. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, the kind of governing body of my industry, they put out a massive report trying to figure out what went wrong. And their end conclusion was kind of a shrug. It could be a lot of different things. We don't really know. And so all of these numbers I've presented to you today, I want to leave you with a note to keep thinking of all of this with a grain of salt. If you care a lot about this election, if you feel very strongly about one candidate or the other, and you turn on the news and you see that your candidate is losing big, take a deep breath. Don't get too upset. And if you turn on the news and you see a poll that says your candidate has surged, they're now winning by 6-7 points, take a pause, take a deep breath. It may not necessarily be right. But ultimately, as pollsters, polling has never been perfect. And now sometimes I always feel like it's important to remind people that the purpose of polls is not to predict elections. Even though that's most of what they wind up having us do, when I go on TV to talk about polls, that's 90% of what they have me discuss. I think that today we're perhaps expecting something from polls that they're simply not built to deliver. That polls are able to take the pulse of America in very broad brushstrokes to help us understand what people are thinking or feeling, rather than to predict something down to the 10th of a point. And so even though polls have actually gotten better over the years on average, they're still not perfect, and we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. So why poll anyway then? If we can't actually trust them to predict an election, what's the point? I think what matters about polling, and what should matter to people in politics and out, is that polling is just an exercise in listening. We don't like talking to people on the other side these days. Nowadays, if you ask people, do you find talking politics with someone you disagree with to be stressful and frustrating, or interesting and informative? In some ways, I'm actually surprised that back in 2016, most people said interesting and informative, but that is not the world we live in today. People don't like talking about this stuff with people they disagree with. The idea of arguing with your uncle over the Thanksgiving dinner table is miserable to most people, and for good reason. But it's important to have some kind of way of knowing what people who disagree with you might actually think. And polls are one way to do that hard work of listening. I got into this industry 20 years ago. I've seen it change a lot from when we were calling people on landline phones to today, where we're trying all sorts of different ways to track down voters and ask them what they think. But ultimately, I think of this as an exercise in listening, and that's what makes me love my job. I came to Washington wanting to be a press secretary, a communications director, someone who would deliver the message of what my principal said, whether I was working for a senator or a member of Congress. Instead, I think I wound up with a much more important principle for whom I work. I try, in my job as a pollster, to be the voice of voters, to try to convey what voters are actually thinking about things. Because if Washington is not going to listen to voters, someone needs to be trying to speak up for them. And so with that, I'd love to take your questions about this election, about polling and more, and thank you again for having me. Larry here in the front row.
There's a couple of constitutional amendments in Florida, one on reproductive rights, one on legalization of marijuana for recreational use. There's like 9 other states that are going to have referendums on abortion to amend their constitutions. That's generally perceived as a pro-democratic position. Do you think that's going to have an influence on the presidential one?
So it's a good question. The question here for anyone who may not have heard is there are certain states that are going to have different referenda on the ballot. In Florida, there's going to be a referenda that would put Roe versus Wade's protections effectively into the state constitution, as well as an expansion of recreational marijuana. So I've seen polling on this, and it's really interesting. You've got a lot of voters here in Florida who say they're voting for Donald Trump, they're voting for the pro-choice amendment, and they're voting for recreational marijuana. So at least in Florida, I have seen a sizable number of kind of split ticket voters if you assume that the other position is more of the Republican position. But that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be that way in every state. And what I also wonder is how it might affect turnout. So again, in Florida, it's pretty much a red state at this point. Not a guarantee, but it leans more red. But some of these states where you may have some of these things on the ballot or where it's been a hot button issue, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that changes voter turnout in a way that is a problem. I believe Montana is one of the states that just in the last couple of days it was announced was going to have something like this on the ballot. Montana is not an interesting presidential state at all. They're definitely going to vote for Donald Trump at the presidential level. But when it comes to the Senate, Montana is actually a really important Senate race, and Republicans only need to effectively pick up 1 or 2 Senate seats in order to win over the Senate, depending on who the president is. So something like Montana and a ballot measure like this driving up turnout could have huge implications in ways that are really non-obvious. Thank you for your question.
Why can't we vote online?
Ooh, so that's a question that's probably not one I can answer very well. The question was, why can't we vote online? So this is, it reminds me of a comic that I've seen. There's a online comic, XKCD, and they have one where I believe it shows like a software engineer who's saying like, yes, do your banking online. Yes, we can do this online. Yes, we can do that online. And then they go, great, can you come up with some voter software? And they go, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. And it's just that there is the potential, I think, for too many people to raise too many questions. I mean, just look at what we have now in terms of declining faith in elections. And this has been inflamed and it's partisan for sure, but you have a lot of people, especially Republicans these days, that don't feel like elections are being done fairly. And so you've had states like Virginia in just the last couple of weeks announce that they're going to have paper ballots as a requirement in order that there be some kind of a paper trail people could go back and validate. I think until we find ways to, and this again gets way outside my pay grade, but things like blockchain or technology that will really allow people to validate it, have their vote validated and attached to their identity in a way that can also protect their privacy and be counted fairly, until that can get figured out, it's going to be hard to get voter trust around the idea of doing something like that. And I suspect it would also have a big generational divide if I ever tested it in a poll. But good question, thank you. Great question. So as I mentioned at the beginning, RFK Jr., who announced to run for president earlier in this election cycle, announced on Friday that he would be withdrawing from the race and endorsing Donald Trump. So what's interesting is originally it was Democrats that thought RFK Jr. was the biggest threat to them. Because if you were one of those double hater type voters, you didn't like Joe Biden and you didn't like Donald Trump, he would be an appealing alternative, and they thought, gosh, we need those people coming to us. And it was true that initially at the beginning, it was more Democrats than Republicans breaking away to him. So at my firm, we did an experiment. In one of our surveys, we did this as an online survey. We put up a picture of RFK Jr. and we put up a picture of RFK. And we asked people, which of these is RFK Jr. who is running for president this year? And if you got it right and you were a Democrat, you actually didn't like him at all. But if you got it wrong and you were a Democrat, you tended to be more likely to say you were voting for RFK Jr. For some portion of Democrats, primarily older Democrats, they just saw the Kennedy name and they thought, oh, I'll pick him. I voted for Kennedys before I liked them. But I always wondered, as more and more people got to know him and hear his message, would that persist? Because his policy positions in many ways lined up a little more closely with Donald Trump's. And sure enough, just a couple of weeks ago, I did a focus group with voters who had voted for Donald Trump in the past, but now said they were disappointed in him. And I asked them about RFK Jr., and many of them said, you know, RFK Jr. is a lot of the things I used to like about Donald Trump. I feel like Donald Trump used to kind of stick it to the man. He wasn't the establishment. He would say the things that can offend people, and he's not afraid of anybody. And now I feel like Trump has kind of gone soft, and he's now, you know, he's the establishment. And so RFK Jr., he's the one that's willing to kind of shake things up. And I thought that is really interesting. And so I think at the end, his voter base was more drawing from Donald Trump and people who almost thought Donald Trump was a bit of a sellout. So with RFK leaving the race, I think if you were somebody who was simply a double hater, you didn't like both of them, as soon as the top of the ticket flipped for Democrats, you immediately broke off and went for Harris. You'll notice actually there was really small text up there, but the polls that have changed the most since Biden and Harris switched out is not that Donald Trump has gained a bunch of new voters. It's that Harris has absorbed a bunch of the former undecideds. But these RFK voters, I think those who are still hanging on, that last 3-4%, are more likely to go to Donald Trump. We'll see over the next few weeks as polls come in that show him out of the race, but that's my suspicion, was that early on he was drawing from Biden, but now at the end, with his final core of supporters still left, they were mostly leaning more toward Trump.
On the generational divide graphic that you showed, the women aged 45 to 64 were way more conservative than any other age group.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, why were the women 45 to 59 so much more conservative than women of other generations? So part of this is something that I uncovered when I was trying to write my book. When people would tell me, oh, millennials, yeah, they're voting for Obama, they're more progressive, but as they get older, they'll definitely get more conservative. I said, I don't know if that's true. Because as you could see, you know, 45 to 59, that wasn't the oldest group up there, and yet it was the most conservative. That was really interesting, what's going on. And what I read was that what happens to a generation when they are their youngest and just getting engaged in politics really has formative effects on their politics throughout their lifetime. So what we find now are voters who are in, say, their 50s, which is the bulk of that group you're talking about. They tended to come of age during the sort of more center-right or even outright conservative, like Reagan era, et cetera. And that has meant that that Gen X kind of generation is more conservative now, either than the baby boomers before them or the millennials and Gen Zers after them. And so that's what I think is going on there, is that for those women who are in that age cohort, it's the Gen Xers who their formative political years were Reagan. They've now gotten a little bit older, but they've still stayed that Republican. But in the same way, for young voters who were millennials and even Gen Z, they're coming of age in a very different time. And I think Republicans are going to have a big problem when the boomers leave the scene and Republicans haven't done a very good job of winning over those young voters who are going to make up the majority of the electorate for decades to come. I've got time for one more question.
What do you think about, and do you think we'll ever see term limits for Congress?
Oh, good question. So the question is, will we ever see term limits for Congress? The problem is that in order to get term limits on Congress, you kind of have to ask Congress to make themselves obsolete. And there are a lot of people in Congress who are over 80 years old. Once they get there, they kind of like to be there for a long time. I'm a little bit torn about term limits. It's the sort of thing where when you poll test it, it poll tests through the roof. People think, you should not be allowed to be in Congress for decade after decade after decade. We need some turnover. But then when you actually look at what Congress does, in some ways, in years where you've swept out a lot of people and you have a bunch of new folks come in, that's oftentimes when Congress is its least functional, when it gets the least done, because you've lost that institutional knowledge. So finding a way to craft a policy that wouldn't kick everybody out after 2 or 3 terms, but also would discourage these people who have been around since I was a child from still being in office is probably healthy for democracy, but finding a way to actually get it passed, even though it's really popular, is going to be a really big challenge. But good question. Thank you all very much for having me today. It's been a real pleasure.